I never imagined the moment would feel this calm. The scholarship boardroom was always kept at an icy 70 degrees, the kind of cold that woke you up even if your nerves tried to put you to sleep. But here I was, sitting at the head of the long oak table, my laptop open, the algorithm dashboard glowing softly across my face. And there, right at the top of the applicant list, were the children of the same parents who used to pat my shoulder with a patronizing smile and say things like, "Sweetie, you should charge less. You're just a tutor, not a real educator." They didn't know I built this system. They didn't know I was the one they would be emailing in blind desperation tonight. They didn't know that the quiet tutor who sat with their kids after school, correcting essays and explaining concepts they never cared to understand, was also the lead architect of the National Scholars Evaluation Model, the system responsible for awarding the most prestigious scholarships in the country. But they were about to. A notification blinked. Another parent email. Another plea. Another urgent matter. I almost smiled, because the irony tasted so sharp it felt like citrus on my tongue. The final evaluation cycle would close in 40 minutes. And every single one of them still thought I was nobody. They would learn soon enough. That moment, that calm, cold, irrefutable moment, is where everything began to turn. But the story doesn't start here. It starts months earlier, in a warm living room with chipped paint and an overworked heater, where I sat cross-legged with my notebook spread out, trying to figure out how people could be so loud and so wrong at the same time. My name is Avalini Dane, and for most of my life, I thought being quiet meant being invisible. I never expected quiet to become my greatest weapon. The afternoons in Maplewood were always the same, sunlight melting through blinds, pencils scratching, the soft thump of kids dropping backpacks on my carpet. Tutoring wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, honest work. And I loved it, not because it paid well, it didn't, not because parents respected me, they didn't, but because the kids tried. They were messy, chaotic, stubborn, brilliant, everything their parents forgot how to be. Take Nora, for example. 11 years old. Wore socks that never matched. She tried so hard to understand fractions, squinting at the page like the numbers were personally insulting her. When she finally got it, she'd shout, "Yes. I dominated this," and pump both fists in the air. But the parents? Completely different species. Mrs. Willoughby was the worst. She'd arrive early just to lecture me about how real educators structured lessons. She once brought a binder of articles printed from some blog and said, "Sweetie, use these. You'll look more professional." Sweetie. The word clung to me like dust. She'd look around my small living room turned tutoring space with thinly veiled pity and say, "Don't worry, you'll get a real job someday. This is good practice." A real job. If only she knew. After the kids left every evening, I'd change the lighting, open my laptop, and enter a different world entirely, the one nobody associated with someone quiet or small time. Lines of code. Predictive models. Neural scoring matrices. The Scholarship Foundation had been struggling for years to modernize, to make the evaluation process fairer, more consistent, less vulnerable to bias. I'd been part of a research fellowship during grad school, building a dynamic scoring model with a team of 3. The foundation bought the prototype. And later, quietly, they hired me as the one person allowed to refine, repair, and eventually control the entire evaluation workflow. No social media announcement. No press release. Just confidentiality agreements and large encrypted folders. The parents thought I made my money explaining decimals. But the truth was, teaching kids was my peace. Designing the scholarship algorithm was my power. And for months, those two worlds lived separate lives. Until the day everything collided, the day I realized how deeply people underestimated me. It was late October, and the wind was cold enough to sting. I was tutoring in the Willoughby sunroom, a space so aggressively renovated it looked like a furniture catalog with no soul. Nora was working through a reading comprehension packet, lips pressed tight, trying so hard not to cry. "Hey," I said gently, sliding beside her. "What's wrong?" "Mom said if I don't get above a 95, I'm not trying hard enough." Her voice cracked. "I am trying." I felt something inside me harden. Before I could speak, the door slid open with its usual too loud clatter, and Mrs. Willoughby walked in with her clipped heels and clipped voice. "How's she doing?" "She's improving," I said evenly. "Meaning she's still behind," she answered, not even looking at her daughter. "Sweetie, Maybe scale down your expectations. Michaela's tutor gives her advanced material. You're more, emotional support. Emotional support. Like I wasn't the one redesigning national evaluation systems. Like I wasn't the reason half their private academy kids would even have a shot at scholarships. But the quiet inside me didn't break. It sharpened. And then she said the line that carved itself into my memory with a cold metallic edge. Honestly, sweet tutors like you should stay in your lane. Leave the high-level academic stuff to people with real qualifications. I could have laughed if it hadn't been painful. Real qualifications? My thesis was used in congressional education hearings. But fine. Let her talk. Let her underestimate me. Let them all. Because I knew something she didn't. Scholarship applications opened in 6 weeks. And the board had already added me to the review panel, meaning every single academic score, essay analysis, extracurricular weight, and recommendation ranking would pass through my algorithm, and through me. A few days later, during a routine conference call with the foundation, they casually dropped the message that changed everything. Avellini, you'll be the direct contact for all appeals and parent inquiries this cycle. We trust your judgment. Which meant one thing. Moments like the ones with Mrs. Willoughby? They were going to become entertaining. As the application season drew closer, the irony of everyday interactions grew heavier. Parents began bragging, whispering, planning, competing. They'd ask me for essay advice with an air of superiority. One father cornered me after a session and said, "You're good with grammar. Maybe you can edit my son's submission before the committee reads it." Before the committee, he said. As if I wasn't part of the committee. As if I wasn't the first person the scholarship files would land with. As if I wasn't the architect of the system scanning their essays for originality and clarity. I never corrected them. I never hinted. Silence was my camouflage, and I wore it like armor. But the turning point, the exact moment everything shifted, came the night the applications went live. I was sitting at my small pine desk, warm lamplight spilling over my keyboard. A gentle rain tapped the windows, soft but steady. My laptop chimed. First application received. I opened the dashboard, fingers steady, heart calm. The student's name appeared. And right beneath it, highlighted and neatly attached, was the parent contact information. Parent, Amelia Willoughby. Of course. The universe had a sense of humor. Her daughter's entire future, the essays, the recommendations, the evaluations, had just landed in the hands of the quiet tutor she treated like background noise. And that was the moment I realized my silence had finally run out of space. Not for vengeance, but for truth. I leaned back, folded my hands, and breathed in slowly. For years, these parents acted like kindness was weakness, like silence was ignorance, like humility was lack of ability. They thought they knew who I was. But they only ever saw the tutor. Never the engineer. Never the architect. Never the decision maker. And now the boardroom was waiting. The applications were open. The algorithm was humming. And I, the girl they labeled quiet, was no longer invisible. I was essential. I was the one they needed. And soon, very soon, they would understand exactly who they had been talking down. I didn't expect the first shift in the air to come from something as small as a misplaced folder, but that's how unravelings always begin, quietly, like a thread slipping loose while no one's looking. 2 days after that tense evening tutoring Elias in the Whitmore kitchen, I arrived at my tiny studio with a stack of ungraded practice essays and a buzzing exhaustion that made my bones feel hollow. I dropped my bag on the table, switched on my desk lamp, and froze. Someone had slipped a thick envelope under my door. My name, Elira Cove, was written in pen across the front. Not printed. Not typed. Written. My stomach sank because handwritten things usually mean someone wants something personal from you. I tore it open and found something far more startling. Copies of emails between the Whitmores and the Hollingsworths, 2 of the wealthiest families in town, both discussing me. Not about my tutoring. Not about scheduling. But about whether they should warn the foundation that Elira is biased. And worse, whether I even belonged in the evaluation room at all. They didn't know I was the architect of the evaluation room. They didn't know the scholarship system literally wouldn't exist without me. But seeing my name treated like a liability, a thing to be neutralized, something small and fragile that needed to be supervised, it lodged in my chest like shrapnel. I flipped through the pages again, my throat tight, my fingers trembling against the thin paper. Who sent this? Why? I didn't have enemies. I barely had friends. My students respected me. Their parents tolerated me. My colleagues barely remembered my name. But someone out there was watching closely enough to intercept emails from the wealthiest homes in town. Someone out there wanted me informed. The envelope had no note. No signature. No hint. Just truth. Raw, unvarnished, ugly truth. I sat down and let the lamp's warm circle of light anchor me as the memories I tried to bury began to scratch their way up again. Memories of the night I built the algorithm that changed everything. I was 22, exhausted from tutoring shifts, surviving on vending machine crackers, and drowning under student loans that felt like shadows tied to my ankles. The foundation had hired me as a temporary data assistant. I wasn't even supposed to be in the meeting that night. I was supposed to be alphabetizing applications. But the board had stayed late, arguing loudly about how subjective the process was, how much money they wasted debating kids who wrote better essays because their parents hired professionals to shape them. I heard words like unfair, politically sensitive, biased, and reputation risk. And then someone actually joked, that what they really needed was some nerd kid who could build a magic filter to separate the real strivers from the polished pretenders. They didn't know I was in the next room. They didn't know I'd spent my entire childhood teaching myself code because books were the only reliable thing in a household where my father drank too loudly and my mother mended other people's lives while letting her own unravel. They didn't know that I understood unfairness more intimately than any of them. That night I stayed after everyone left. I didn't ask for permission. I sat at an empty workstation and built the first version of the screening algorithm, one that analyzed socioeconomic context, writing authenticity markers, grade stability, and volunteer patterns. Not the kind that could be coached or polished, but the kind that reflected reality. I handed it to them the next morning. They laughed. Then they tested it. Then they funded it. And then they forgot who made it. My phone vibrated on the desk, jolting me back into the present. A message flashed across the screen from River Dane, a data analyst at the foundation who'd once covered for me when I accidentally slept through a morning meeting after a week of non-stop coding. You need to come in early tomorrow. Something's off with this season's batch. My pulse skipped. River never dramatized. If he said something was off, something was off. I typed back quickly, be there at 7. As soon as I hit send, I felt a new unease stirring beneath the old one. Something was building, like two tectonic plates of my life were grinding toward each other, preparing for an earthquake I'd spent years pretending would never come. I tried sleeping. I couldn't. So I graded essays until dawn cast a pale wash over the vinyl floors of my studio. By the time I walked into the foundation, the air smelled like burnt coffee and impending crisis. River stood beside the conference table, hair disheveled, glasses smudged, tapping through applications with unusual tension in his shoulders. Look at this, he said, sliding his laptop toward me. I studied the screen. Lines of data. Flags. Irregular patterns. And then I saw it. The same last names showing up in clusters, all from families I knew too well, Whitmore, Hollingsworth, Lena, Risson, all scoring suspiciously high in authenticity metrics. Impossible. My algorithm specifically detected artificially enhanced essays. Someone bypassed the verification, I whispered. River nodded, jaw tight. Someone found a backdoor. A cold wave surged through me. Who has access? That's the thing, he said. Only board members. And you. I froze. There it was. The perfect storm waiting to happen. The wealthy families trying to discredit me. The tampered essays benefiting their children. And me, caught directly between them. River softened. I know you didn't do this, Elira. But if the board starts asking questions, they'll believe the parents, I finished quietly. They always do. After hours of analyzing timestamps and hidden logs, I finally spotted it, an unauthorized login using a board-level credential belonging to Dr. Selwyn Harrow, the chairman. My stomach lurched. Selwyn always smiled too warmly at donors and too coolly at staff. He'd once told me, without irony, that brilliant people should avoid drawing attention to themselves. And now someone was using his access to manipulate the rankings. He'll deny it, River said. He always does, I replied. But he won't be able to deny it when we trace the IP address. River exhaled, relieved. Then we'll expose him. I hesitated. Not yet. He blinked. Elira, if we confront the board without understanding why they're doing this, they'll bury everything. We need leverage. He looked at me with a mixture of admiration and worry. You scare me sometimes. Good, I said softly. They scare me too. I left the foundation with a quiet fire building in my chest. Not rage, not yet, but something steadier, sharper. Insight. I headed straight to the Whitmore estate for my afternoon session with Elias, walking past the marble columns that felt cold even in daylight. His mother, Cambria Whitmore, stood in the foyer wearing an expression that always made me feel like a stray cat wandering through her curated world. You're late, she said. By 3 minutes, I replied, keeping my voice calm. She flinched, unused to pushback. I suppose we should expect flexibility from independent workers. I ignored the jab, stepping past her into the study where Elias waited. He sat slumped over his notebook, shoulders drawn in. Rough day? I asked. He nodded. Mom had brunch with the Hollingsworths. They talked about which tutors were properly connected for the scholarship season. I inhaled slowly. And what did they say about me? He grimaced. They said you were sweet but small-time. The words landed like old bruises touched again. But this time something inside me didn't crumble. It clicked. I leaned down, lowering my voice. Elias, listen carefully. Never confuse volume with truth. Quiet people build entire worlds while loud people perform in them. His eyes widened like the words struck a place inside him he had been trying to protect. That's when the front door opened so hard it echoed through the house. Voices. Urgent. Muttering. Cambria's shoes clicking rapidly against marble. Then a hissed whisper, are you sure? Another voice, absolutely. One of our contacts at the foundation said Elira's involvement is suspicious. If she stays on, the whole selection could be compromised. I stilled completely. Elias looked terrified. Elira, they don't know you're here. They don't need to, I said softly. Not yet. I stood up, smoothed my sleeves, and stepped into the hallway. Cambria and Mrs. Hollingsworth froze mid-conversation. Their eyes widened. They looked caught, cornered, guilty. But that wasn't the part that struck me hardest. The part that carved itself into my memory was the flicker, just one, of fear. Fear of me. Fear of what I might know. Fear that their children's futures were slipping out of their grasp. Something in me shifted then, the quiet girl they thought I was folded away, and something steadier rose. Is there a problem? I asked politely. Too politely. Cambria swallowed. We were just discussing some concerns about this year's process. Concerns. I repeated. About credibility, Mrs. Hollingsworth added. And influence. Influence, I echoed slowly, isn't inherently a bad thing. It's only dangerous when misused. The women exchanged a quick look, one I wasn't meant to see. One that confirmed everything. I smiled. Small. Controlled. Final. I'll finish today's session with Elias. After that, you may not need to schedule future ones. Their relief was too quick. Too obvious. Too telling. They wanted me gone because they believed I was powerless. They would soon learn exactly how wrong they were. When I stepped back into the study, Elias looked pale. Are you leaving? Not yet, I told him gently. But things are about to change. For me? He whispered. For all of you, I said. And for them. Because tonight, for the first time in years, I wasn't going to hide behind silence. Tonight I would log into the system I built. And tonight I would pull every thread until the entire truth came tumbling out into the light. The email sat in my inbox like a quiet spark waiting to ignite something bigger. Avelini, preliminary applicant flags detected. Please review manually. It wasn't unusual for the system to ask me to review cases personally. After all, I had built half its logic from scratch. But this time, hovering over the notification, I felt something shift beneath the surface. Because 3 of the flagged names were children whose parents had dismissed me just hours before. The ones who had laughed about my little tutor job, who had brushed past me like I was a piece of dust floating in their hallway. It would have been so easy to feel vindicated. But instead, I just sat there for a moment, letting my breath settle, letting the weight of what I was about to step into take its full shape. The late afternoon light spilled across my desk, painting long golden lines over my keyboard. I leaned back in my chair and clicked open the first application. It belonged to Nora Tisdale, the same Nora whose mother had practically shoved me out of the living room with a sharp "Thanks, dear, we'll take it from here." Nora herself was sweet, bright, scattered, and always one step behind because her mother pushed for perfection instead of curiosity. I had spent weeks trying to convince Mrs. Tisdale to let Nora breathe. But her mother only listened long enough to criticize my teaching method or my soft approach. Now the system flagged Nora's essay for discrepancy indicators. My stomach tightened. Plagiarism. Or something close. I scrolled slowly, smoothing a finger along the edge of my desk as I read, line after line, the subtle mechanical tone of a language model rewrite, polished to artificial perfection. And beneath it, the faint ghost of Nora's actual writing, which I recognized instantly. I closed my eyes and leaned forward, resting my forehead on my clasped hands. This wasn't just a mistake, this was sabotage. And not by Nora. I clicked the metadata. The timestamp for the essay upload didn't match Nora's login pattern. It matched her mother's. Of course. I opened the next 2 flagged files and felt the same cold ache settle in my chest. All 3 parents had adjusted their children's work, rewriting essays, altering recommendation letters, even adding padding to academic records. They weren't helping their children. They were hollowing them out from the inside, turning them into puppets dressed in false polish. A quiet, steady heat warmed the back of my throat. This wasn't just unethical. It was cruel. It was the exact kind of manipulation I had grown up watching, adults dressing children in borrowed expectations. My mother's voice drifted to me like a small memory tucked under old fabric. Let them underestimate you, Ovalini. There's a freedom in being unseen. She used to whisper that while I worked on my projects in our small apartment living room, coding until my fingers cramped, building the early form of the algorithm the foundation would later buy from me. No one knew the truth of that story, the years of sacrifice, the endless nights, the loneliness of carrying brilliance without a voice to speak it aloud. And these parents, they mocked me, dismissed me, but they didn't know they were handing me the exact evidence the board would take seriously. Not because I wanted revenge, but because the children deserved better. I saved each file into a protected folder, marking them with my reviewer tag, and pushed away from the desk. The room felt too small suddenly, like the walls held secrets I had kept too long. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the early evening chill, letting the cold sweep over my skin like a reminder to stay steady. On the sidewalk, the city hummed with traffic, lights blinking like coded signals. My steps found a natural rhythm as I walked toward the scholarship office, a small building tucked between a bakery and a law firm. Most reviewers worked remotely, but I preferred being close. It helped me think. Inside, the security guard nodded at me with warm familiarity. "Working late again, Miss Hale?" "Just finishing a few things," I said, returning the smile. He didn't know the full truth. No one here did. Only the board president and 2 founding members knew that I had been the architect behind the selection algorithm, the one responsible for spotting fraud, manipulation, and mismatched authenticity patterns. I didn't advertise it. I didn't sign my name publicly. Quiet power was still power. I settled into a private office room and pulled up the live applicant dashboard. As the system loaded, my eyes caught a blinking banner. Preliminary ranking window will publish next week. Meaning any parent who tried to bury their children's real work behind artificial perfection was running out of time to fix it, and they didn't even know I was the one reviewing. I opened Nora's profile one more time and stared at her video interview clip from last month. A 15-year-old girl with soft brown hair tucked behind her ears, smiling nervously into the camera as she talked about wanting to study environmental biology. Her voice trembled when she said she wanted to actually help real people, not just win something shiny. She meant every word. And her mother was suffocating that sincerity with shortcuts. I hit record and spoke softly into the mic, creating an internal note. Applicant demonstrates genuine intellectual curiosity. Essay inconsistency appears to originate from guardian interference. Recommend direct interview follow-up. When I finished, I felt something sharp and electric settle in the center of my chest, not anger, not pride but clarity. These kids weren't competition pieces. They were human beings who deserved honesty. I kept reviewing until exhaustion lapped at my bones, and by the time I stepped out onto the street again, the sky had deepened into blue-black velvet. My breath fogged as I exhaled, the night pressing quiet against my shoulders. Halfway home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't save, but recognized instantly from countless condescending group chats. Mrs. Tisdale, hi dear. Nora mentioned you were fixing something with scholarships? I hope you're not overstepping. These decisions are for real experts. A cold laugh escaped my lips, not cruel, just tired. Real experts. If only she knew. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Parents whispered near the bakery. People refreshed scholarship rumors on their phones. And through a web of gossip, one line floated constantly to the surface. The board is conducting a deeper review this year. Of course they were. I had requested it myself. Quietly. Seamlessly. Without raising a single red flag. But things escalated in a way I didn't expect. Around noon, I walked into the community library where I usually held weekend workshops, a small room filled with mismatched chairs and painted bookcases. A few parents stood near the entrance, talking in tense voices. I ignored them and headed for the staff room to set up my materials. Before I reached the door, someone stepped in front of me. Mrs. Tisdale. Her smile stretched too tight, brittle like old tape. Avellini, can I talk to you? Of course, I said gently, though something in my chest braced. She lowered her voice. I heard some nonsense today that scholarship reviewers can see all applicant editing logs. Obviously, that's exaggerated, but you would tell me if something was wrong with Nora's application, right? You work with kids. You have a heart. Her words dipped low on kid and sharp on heart, like she was holding a leash she assumed I'd stay on. I do have a heart, I said softly. That's why I believe applications should reflect the student, not the parent. Her jaw tightened. Are you implying something? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth hovered between us, warm and frightening. She leaned in closer. You're a tutor, Avellini. They don't let people like you make real decisions. Something inside me went silent. Still. Cold. Not hurt, just done. She walked away with her chin lifted, but her steps faltered. She felt it, even if she didn't understand it yet. The shift. The imbalance. The quiet power creeping in from the edges. By evening, 3 more parents had reached out, all in the same sugary tone, all fishing for information, all trying to gauge whether their interference had been detected. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. But they were circling around it like moths realizing the light was hotter than they expected. That night, as I sat in my room with my laptop open, the foundation system blinked with a new alert. Board meeting scheduled, urgent integrity review. I stared at the glowing words until they blurred in my vision. This was it, the moment everything shifted from quiet observation to visible consequence. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just the truth rising where their arrogance had pushed too far. And part of me, the girl who grew up coding in a dim apartment, ignored by everyone except the mother who believed in her, felt a quiet, steady fire spark into life. They had no idea what part of the story they were stepping into. But I did. Perfectly. Precisely. Finally. Tomorrow, the board would meet. And their children's files would be projected onto a screen they never imagined I controlled. And after years of being the quiet tutor, I was about to speak in a language they couldn't ignore. The morning of the board meeting, the air felt electric in a way that made my chest tighten, not with nerves, but with the calm weight of inevitability. I walked into the foundation office, my laptop in my bag, my thoughts quiet but sharp. Everyone knew I was the architect of the system, everyone knew I ran the risk assessments and authenticity audits. No one knew how thoroughly I had mapped the parents who tried to manipulate their children's submissions. And today, all of that would be impossible to ignore. As I stepped into the conference room, the board members were already seated, their polished suits and clipped voices exuding authority and confidence. Dr. Selwyn Harrow, the chairman whose credentials alone were enough to intimidate most of the staff, glanced at me with a casual, patronizing smile. I returned it with neutrality that felt like steel. No one in this room would make assumptions today. Not about me. Not about my work. Good morning, Avellini, Selwyn began, not hiding the faint edge of doubt in his tone. We've received some unusual flags in this year's applications. Can you walk us through what you found? I slid my laptop onto the table, opened it, and brought up the first flagged application. Charts, timestamps, and audit trails projected clearly onto the wall. The board leaned in instinctively, their confident composure wavering for the first time as I spoke. Here, I said, pointing to the top entry, is Nora Tisdale. Her essay shows indicators of parent-assisted rewriting. The timestamps confirm that her guardian accessed the submission outside normal login patterns. There's nothing wrong with her intelligence or potential, but the record here doesn't reflect her authentic work. Selwyn raised an eyebrow. Are you implying misconduct by parents? I looked directly at him, voice calm but unyielding. I am stating the facts as they appear in the system. Any further interpretation is up to this board. A murmur traveled through the room. Some members shifted uncomfortably, papers rustling as they tried to process the implications. I continued, methodically walking through the next 2 flagged applications. Each case was similar, highly polished essays, suspicious login patterns, inconsistencies between the student's previous submissions and current work. Each parent who had underestimated me, each voice that had whispered sweet but small time, was exposed in subtle, undeniable clarity. By the time I reached the final file, the room was tense. Dr. Lane, one of the senior reviewers who had always quietly trusted me, nodded slightly, acknowledging the precision of my audit. The parents' interference was no longer a rumor. It was documented, verified, and undeniable. Selwyn's jaw tightened. Avellini, do you realize the implications of what you're presenting? These are prominent families. High visibility. Significant influence. I didn't flinch. I do. Which is why the integrity of the scholarship process cannot be compromised. The system is impartial, and I am impartial. That is my responsibility. There was silence for a long, heavy moment. I could see the subtle shifts in posture, the eyes darting to one another as if asking, did anyone else know this would happen? Then came the emails, dozens of messages that had been queued overnight from parents nervously checking in, assuming they could still manipulate outcomes. I opened them on the laptop, each one appearing on the screen for the board to see. The whispers of panic grew palpable, though the parents were not in the room. Words like urgent, help, advice, and favor blinked in bright rectangles. Each message was a silent admission of interference. I leaned back slightly, letting the tension settle into the air. Everything you see here, I said, is the consequence of parent interference. The students themselves are not compromised. Their evaluations are still reflective of their actual abilities. Selwyn cleared his throat, the thin veneer of authority cracking just slightly. And you built this? I let the words hang. I built the algorithm. I oversee the audit trails. I ensure that these applications reflect the truth, not the manipulation of external parties. A subtle shift ran through the boardroom. Some reviewers exchanged quick glances. Others scribbled notes furiously. For the first time, I felt the full weight of my years of quiet work settling in the room like an unspoken verdict. Meaning, one member finally asked, voice trembling slightly, meaning you've had full access and oversight of the system from the beginning? Yes, I replied. From the start. Another pause. Then a sharp intake of breath from Selwyn. His polished smile had vanished. His hands clenched around his notes. The room smelled faintly of fear, something tangible and almost electric. I reached across the table, pulling up a side dashboard showing historical data. Every submission, every login, every anomaly is traceable. Every attempt at manipulation is visible. If parents believe they can influence outcomes, the system ensures transparency. There is no ambiguity. They swallowed. Hard. Do you realize, Selwyn finally said, voice low, the implications for the Foundation's reputation? I did. But reputation was secondary to integrity. I had built this system for fairness, not prestige. I do. And that is why it is imperative that the board act on facts, not influence. The rest of the meeting was procedural, almost perfunctory. Questions came, discussions followed, but the underlying current was clear. I held the authority. Quiet, methodical, undeniable authority. No one could override the system without leaving a digital trace. And no one could question my impartiality without contradicting months of verified audits. After the meeting adjourned, I stayed behind, gathering my laptop and papers. Selwyn lingered for a moment, watching me with something close to incredulity. "I suppose," he said finally, voice tight, "that we underestimated you." I smiled faintly, letting the weight of the moment rest between us. "Perhaps," I said softly. "But the students should never be underestimated." I walked out of the boardroom into the bright afternoon light, the warm sun a stark contrast to the tension I had left behind. Outside, the world seemed oblivious to the quiet revolution that had just occurred inside those walls. Parents would call, they would whisper, they would fume, but the foundation, the students, and the integrity of the scholarship system would remain intact. That evening, as I returned home, the quiet of my apartment wrapped around me like a familiar cloak. I made tea, opened my laptop, and checked the system once more. Every submission, every anomaly, every intervention attempt was catalogued, flagged, and secure. The quiet tutor had become the silent authority. The unassuming woman who parents had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated now controlled the narrative, the outcomes, and the integrity of the process. A soft chime notified me of a new email. It was from Nora herself. "Thank you for helping me this year. I don't know how you do it, but I feel like my work actually matters. Even if my mom doesn't understand that." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with power. This was the reason I had done it. Not revenge. Not status. Not recognition. But truth. Integrity. Justice for the students who deserved it all along. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting the calm settle over me. Quiet had always been my refuge. Now, it had become my strength. Tomorrow, the parents would wake to a new reality. Their attempts at manipulation had failed. The children they had tried to control were safe. And the quiet tutor they had dismissed was untouchable. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to exhale fully. Because the world had finally caught up to the quiet girl they thought they knew. The morning light crept softly through my apartment windows, painting everything in muted gold, but inside, I felt anything but muted. The city outside hummed as usual, oblivious to the quiet storm I had unleashed in the foundation. Parents who had sneered at me, who had whispered behind their children's backs, who had dismissed me as the sweet but small-time tutor, were now scrambling quietly, carefully, because their manipulation had been laid bare. And the best part, they didn't even know the full extent of what I had done. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop, not out of necessity, but out of habit. I wanted to see the final cascade of changes, the tangible aftermath of months of quiet vigilance. Each report I had filed, each flagged application, each traceable login irregularity had now been catalogued in the foundation system. Nothing could be undone. Integrity had won. And for the first time, I felt a deep, enduring satisfaction, not the hollow glee of revenge, but the warm certainty of justice. My phone buzzed. A message from Elias. "Ms. Cove. I got it. The scholarship. Thank you for believing in me." I smiled and typed a quick reply, "You earned it. Always trust your own voice." That was the truth I had always wanted to teach, not just to him, but to every student whose parents had tried to silence them with fear, manipulation, or expectation. Talent alone wasn't enough. Integrity and authenticity were what carried them through. Later that day, the foundation released a statement. It was brief, neutral, official, all scholarship applications reviewed, all discrepancies addressed, all interference documented. The announcement sent subtle tremors through the local social circles. Parents who had tried to bend the system without thinking now faced a quiet reckoning. The cleverness of my years of quiet labor, an invisible but immovable force, was finally visible to the world. And then came the final piece of poetic justice, the one that no one saw coming. A few hours later, I received an invitation in the mail, not email, real postal mail, hand-delivered with a crisp, official seal. The Whitmores and Hollingsworths were hosting a small gala, and they had invited all the scholarship winners and their families. I didn't need the invitation. But curiosity, and a desire for closure, led me to accept. The evening arrived with its polished chandeliers, the soft hum of polite laughter, and the glint of carefully curated wealth. For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of the outsider's gaze, the same one that had followed me when I drove my old sedan past their estates, when I tutored their children quietly and respectfully, when I smiled politely at their condescension. But this time, I wasn't the outsider. I was essential. I was recognized. I had the quiet authority that could never be challenged. Cambria Whitmore approached first, her smile tight and carefully maintained. "Avellini," she said, almost too formally. We were so impressed with the scholarship results this year. Truly remarkable." I returned her smile, small and controlled, letting just a flicker of knowing rest in my eyes. "I'm glad the students' work was recognized," I said softly. "They deserved it." Her jaw tightened just slightly, as though she realized the truth without me needing to say a word. Every attempt to manipulate had been recorded, catalogued, and corrected. Every whisper of doubt she and her peers had spread about me was now irrelevant. I was untouchable, not because of wealth or influence, but because of quiet, meticulous, undeniable competence. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite greetings and congratulatory notes. I watched the parents carefully, noting the subtle shifts in their demeanor, the glances exchanged when they realized just how much they had underestimated me. And somewhere in that crowded room, I felt the culmination of years of patience, skill, and perseverance. The quiet tutor they had mocked now stood at the center of influence without ever needing to demand attention. Later, I slipped away from the gala and walked the quiet streets alone. The city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier drizzle, giving the night a shimmering, cinematic quality. I felt the cool air against my skin and smiled. The storm had passed, leaving behind clarity and order. No one could take that away. No one could rewrite the narrative of my work, my integrity, or my careful stewardship of justice. As I approached my apartment, I reflected on the journey. From the early nights coding alone, the dismissed tutoring sessions, the parents' quiet mockery, the moments of doubt, and the tiny sparks of hope in my students' eyes, everything had led here. I had taken the quiet strength I had cultivated for so long and transformed it into undeniable authority. And in doing so, I had not only ensured fairness for the students but reclaimed my own sense of power. I sat by my window, watching the city settle into night. A single streetlight flickered, and I let myself exhale, feeling the satisfaction of work completed, the thrill of a quiet triumph fully realized. I thought of Nora, Elias, and the countless students whose voices would now be heard without distortion or interference. And I thought of myself, not the timid, overlooked tutor, but the one who had silently reshaped the system, held the manipulators accountable, and preserved the integrity of every honest effort. The quiet had been my refuge, my armor, and ultimately my weapon. And as the night deepened, I whispered softly to myself, a vow and a promise: I am the one who watches, the one who corrects, the one who ensures fairness. And I will never be underestimated again. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of years lift. The storm of doubt, dismissal, and underestimation had passed. What remained was clarity, control, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served, subtle, meticulous, and utterly complete. And somewhere, far below the polished city streets, the whispers of parents who had once mocked me drifted away, fading into irrelevance. I had risen, silently, and their attempts to control or diminish me had crumbled like dust. The quiet tutor had become unforgettable. The night was mine. The truth was mine. And the students' futures, the ones I had fought for without recognition, were finally untouchable. The story had come full circle. The overlooked girl, mocked and underestimated, had quietly orchestrated justice, ensuring that the only voices that mattered now were those of truth, integrity, and merit. And with that, I allowed myself the softest, most triumphant smile. Because this was more than revenge. It was a victory of patience, skill, and quiet resilience. And it was absolute.